Ukraine just hinted us its simply genius plan to liberate Crimea, and we are literally one final step away from this to happen. At the same time, this will most likely allow Ukrainians to ultimately win in this war, and because of this, Russians started talking about the security guarantees for their country. But more about all of this in just a couple of minutes. What's up, investors? It's the Russian dude. And let's go straight to the point and see some most recent footage. And our first video comes to us from Poland, where we can see approximately 800 units of military vehicles which have been delivered by the United States. This is the initiative by the Americans to show the NATO countries its willingness to support the stability in Eastern Europe. Next we go to Russian Bryansk, which is located to the north of Ukraine. And as you can see from this video, there has been an allegedly drone attack against Slava factory. The drones reportedly fell several meters away from diesel reservoirs, which caused the fire. And speaking more about attacks against the territory of Russia, pretty much similar event happened in Kursk. Because as you can see right here, reportedly another drone targeted the oil storage located very close to the airfield. The intensity of fire increased dramatically, and since these are basically petroleum products, it is obviously not that easy to put them out. That is why, as you can see right here, the fire lasted through the entire night and the morning. Next we go to already familiar Engels Airport, located in Saratov region. And as you can see from this satellite image, Russians did try to extinguish the fire next to one of their bombers, Tu-95. The reasons that allowed me to make this conclusion, it is because we can see the scorch marks on the ground, as well as firefighting foam next to the plane. But if you remember from my previous episode, Russians claimed that these were only minor damages. It was only Russia who previously attacked the territory of another country, and they obviously never expected that something similar can happen on their own land. And because of this, the next time they will be planning terroristic attacks against Ukraine, they will also have to think about their own safety. And according to this article, it was indeed Ukrainian drones which were used for these attacks, which were most likely the response of Ukrainians to all these mass attacks by Russians in the past. Such as, for example, the most recent one, which happened on December 5th, and some of these missiles, as you can see from this video, were launched from the Black Sea. And according to Forbes estimations, Russia spent approximately anywhere between $400 to $500 million on these attacks during this day alone. Without a doubt, this has a significant impact on the budget of Russia, but at the same time, they are depleting their missile supplies very quick. And according to the head of Ukraine's defense intelligence, Kirill Budanov, Russia has only enough missiles for only a few of such attacks. He says that Russians produce missiles way slower than they use them, and this deal with Iran is not yet fully operational. And eventually he expects that there will be no more attacks of Russians against the territory of Ukraine, and at the same time Russian soldiers will no longer be able to advance anywhere. And at that point it will become a complete stalemate for the Russian forces, and the situation will only get worse for them every single day. But another extremely important thing to take into consideration is that according to the Ministry of Defense of Ukraine, Alexei Reznikov, such attacks of Russians will only bring the victory of Ukraine way sooner. And the reason for this, according to him, is that the consequences of these mass shellings will have the completely opposite effect. Which means that Russians who want to destroy the energy infrastructure of Ukraine and leave them without light or electricity, they hope that this will break the spirit of Ukrainians. But in reality, what happens is that after every single mass attack of Russians, Ukrainians only become even more furious, united and determined to win against Russia. At this very moment, pretty much every single week, the situation gets a little bit better and better for Ukrainians. And if you want to stay with me all the way until the end of this war, just please consider liking this video and subscribing to my channel. You can also follow me on Instagram and ask me a question and I will reply to you. Alright, and before I talk about some very interesting updates from the east, let's see a little bit more encouraging footage, because today is the day of the armed forces of Ukraine. And our first picture comes to us from Kharkov, where you can see President Zelensky visiting the injured soldiers in one of the hospitals. But what's even more important is that right before this visit, he recorded a video congratulating Ukrainians from Slovyansk. And as you can see, this settlement is located only several kilometers away from the battlefronts. Which, to be honest, is kind of a good response to Maria Zakharova, who claimed that Zelensky never left his bunker. But okay, because then we have a picture from Belgorod where we can see that the governor of this region decided to create a territorial defense forces. And I mean, isn't it just interesting how it went from capturing Kiev in 3 days to no panic anywhere, and now Russians are creating defense forces on their own territories. Right, because then we have this picture of our notorious Senor Girkin reportedly somewhere in the east. And shortly after that, he made a post on his social media that in fact he was departed back to Moscow. And the reason for this, it is because some kind of bureaucracy or some paperwork or something this and that, and it's all very corrupted and nothing is quite clear. Okay, and now as promised, let's really quick talk about the situation in the east. And first of all, according to the report by the Institute for the Study of War, Ukrainians continue their counteroffensive along Svatove-Crimea road, while the main focus of Russians was the same, next to Bakhmut, Avdiivka and Donetsk city. But one new thing here is that Russians reportedly were sending small groups of 10-15 people trying to breach the defenses of Ukrainians. And at the same time, Ukrainians increased their pressure to the north of Crimea for this part of P-66 highway. And reportedly, Russians tried to breach through Ukrainian lines of defenses in Yakovlivka, Solidar, Bakhmut, Kurdyumivka and Krasnohoriivka, but all of these attacks were repelled by Ukrainians. And then right here we have a picture from last week of Russian Su-24M fighter jet being intercepted in Bakhmut area. And as we move more to the south, a shelling has been reported in Donetsk city. But according to the local residents, the majority of these missiles came from Makiivka, which as you can see right here is located to the east of Donetsk. Which most likely allows us to assume that these were Russians behind these attacks with the only purpose to blame Ukrainians for the mass shelling. And as a result of this, a Russian infiltrator, the member of Donetsk parliament Maria Pirogova, has been eliminated. As you can see, today I have a little bit more footage, but as always, more than 90% of photos and videos I'm simply not able to use on YouTube. For this reason, I uploaded some of it to my Discord and the rest will be available on my Patreon. And if you want to have the early access to this prohibited footage, the links will be down below. Alright, and before I talk about this genius plan of Ukrainians to retake Crimea, it is very important to mention some updates from the south. And first of all, according to the same report by the Institute for the Study of War, the artillery duels pretty much continued along Dnipro River, with Russian main focus being against Kherson city. At the same time, Russians continue their massive retreats, mainly from Oleshki, Holopristan and Nova Kakhovka, and their directions was to go to Crimea and deeper into Kherson region. And at the same time, Ukrainians are still allegedly present on Kinburn Spit and left side of Dnipro River, but due to informational silence, there is not much known about their activities. And as we go a little bit to the west, to Odessa, we can see the image of a part of Russian missile which fell next to the city. And then we move to Crimea itself, where we can see Russians demolishing Ukrainian hotel Zori Ukraine. And if you remember from my yesterday's episode, Russians were doing pretty much the same in Mariupol. They were demolishing the older buildings severely affected by the shelling, and as they said, it is to free some space for new constructions. But in reality, according to Ukrainians, Russians were simply trying to hide the evidence of their war crimes. Which pretty much means that they are trying to do the same in Crimea, anticipating the early arrival of Ukrainian forces. And right now is just the perfect time to talk about this simply genius plan of Ukrainians to liberate Crimea. And to be honest, it looks like we are in the final stage. Because according to the Major General of Ukrainian forces, Sergei Savchenko, the liberation of Melitopol will be the last step before Ukrainians can liberate Crimea. What he basically means is that those Ukrainians who are currently trying to push against Tokmak, their next ultimate goal will be to go to Melitopol. And in extremely likely case scenario, in case they are successful, they will be able to divide the south in Ukraine into two parts, the west and the east. And in addition to completely disrupting the logistics of Russians between Crimea and the rest of Ukraine, Ukrainians will be able to get closer to the Black Sea border and to Azov Sea border. Which basically means that the Russian fleet in these areas will become in range for Ukrainian attacks. As a result of this, Russians will no longer be able to do mass attacks against Ukrainian land, or at least their intensity will decrease significantly. And like mentioned previously, this is pretty much the only thing left for Russians to do, which is to attack the energy infrastructure of Ukraine. Because Russian soldiers, as you can already see it, simply cannot advance anywhere. But in case they do try to advance, this always comes at a great cost, such as for example in the east of Ukraine, where they are willing to give up hundreds or even thousands of soldiers just for the opportunity to advance 1,000 meters. In addition to that, as soon as Ukrainians can move closer to the border between Kherson and Crimea, besides Russian logistics, their military bases will also become in range for Ukrainian HIMARS. And their only way to resupply themselves in this peninsula will be through Crimean Bridge, but as we all already know, it is not as protected. And that is why Russia once again started softening its narrative, hinting the negotiations, and what is even more importantly, asking for security guarantees in case they want to end this war. As you can see right here, for example, according to the press secretary of Russia, Dmitry Peskov, even though the objectives of this special military operation will be completed, the main goal remains the same, which is the long-lasting peace. We also have the statement by the president of Belarus, Alexander Lukashenko, the biggest supporter of Russia, who also claims that the peace talks should be resumed. And speaking about just the regular citizens of Russia, it is estimated that anywhere between 55 to 60% of regular Russians are in favor of negotiations. People are simply getting tired of this meaningless war, and the Russian leadership is no longer able to present them with any kinds of victories. And this also has a significant impact on the morale of the Russian soldiers, who pretty much clearly understand that at this very moment the only reason for them fighting so hard is to stay in the same place. Russians are barely advancing anywhere, and if they decide to reduce the intensity of fighting, Ukrainians will only retake back their territories even faster. But then there is another very important thing to take into consideration. So, you obviously remember these fake referendums where Russia annexed Luhansk, Donetsk, Zaporozhye and Kherson regions. And as soon as Ukraine was able to liberate a big chunk of Kherson earlier last month, Russians did not resist as much, which allows me and many other people to assume that probably the reason for this annexation is so that later Russia can use these territories in order to try and save Crimea. And this is what it means. In case the peace talks are indeed resumed, Putin might say, okay, I'm ready to give up Kherson, Zaporozhye and even Donbass as long as you let me keep Crimea. And I mean, Ukraine at this point is obviously fighting to get all of its territories back, including the peninsula, but Putin thinks that it might be worth a try. And another thing that hints us about these potential negotiations in the nearest future is that Russia started to ask for security guarantees. And this statement came to us from the Deputy Minister of Foreign Affairs, Sergei Rybkov. But no matter how much Russia tries to hide the real truth, there is only one thing that remains the same, which is that the Russian leadership sooner or later tries to subconsciously prepare its people for an upcoming defeat. And this statement is also confirmed by the head of Defense Intelligence of Ukraine, Kirill Budanov. He says that the main Russian propagandists, instead of focusing their hatred against Ukrainians, now they start criticizing Russian generals for their failures in this war. So it's pretty much the first step in this preparation: find the ones to blame. And the second thing is that the Russian narrative is no longer about winning this war, because this simply is not happening. And for this reason, the main goal of the Russian propaganda is how to deliver this message to the people that their country is not going to lose. But anyways, the liberation of Crimea will be the worldwide event, and every single person will be talking about this. And if you don't want to miss this once it starts happening, just please subscribe to my channel. It only takes one click. And if you want to support my work, please consider becoming my channel member, use a PayPal link, or become my Patreon, where you'll receive early access to the additional footage. You can find all the other useful links to the right and down below. Thank you so much for your attention, товарищи, and see you tomorrow.